constellations that allow for a quick coverage in areas without actually having to carry out significant investments. And then we can reach those corners of the country that have not been reached by certain technologies. We are also providing tenders for secondary use of the spectrum so that there can be leases. We are working on shared use of the spectrum. We're working on access to infrastructure because, as you know, in Mexico, we have multiple obligations in order to get to the infrastructure of the biggest operator, but we also have a shared network as well. That is a model for the region right now. We also are working on the development of a national infrastructure system as well to know what we can access. And we are also collaborating with the federal government as well. And what this means is that these recommendations to have public-private associations and partnerships in this recommendation of sharing, you're on, the person was on mute, I'm sorry. Now, regarding the analog shutdown, we did that in order to release the 700 megahertz band. And from there onwards, we created a shared network. And we actually carried out a legal tender, and there was a public-private partnership, and the winner was actually the person who was providing the best coverage. And 92.2% of the population will be getting coverage by January 2024, and then we have a collaboration to have enough for everyone. And with that, I would like to wrap up my presentation, reminding you that this kind of forum allows for us to cooperate and share the best international practices. And I hope that this commitment and this agreement that we have just spread across the region so that we can reach the digital transformation of the Americas. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Arturo. Thank you for sharing the work that has been done in Mexico and the work of the PCC too. And before giving way to Doreen, I do want to read the questions so that when we move into the second round, you can answer those questions. One of the question that was asked for Mr. Carlos Lugo will not be read because he is no longer here. There are general questions as well in the Q&A. There's a question for Ecuador as well. It says there's a similar project in Nicaragua called Wi-Fi Parks, and the challenge has been guaranteeing the participation of multiple private operators. So does Ecuador create this just by the government, or do you have agreements with operators as well? And are these agreements subsidized? That's the question for Ecuador. And then there's a question for Peru. Peru has carried out a significant investment in broadband fiber optic infrastructure. So what are the mechanisms that you have developed for this infrastructure to be used by all sectors related to telecommunications? And what percentage of that infrastructure is being used currently? There is also a question for Mr. Diego Carrillo. How can you have compatible community centers that match the social distance that we have with a pandemic? How do you deal with social distance in the centers? Then there is a question for Mr. Carlos Lugo, but I won't ask him. Then there's a question for Peru. I felt that the proposal of Peru was very interesting. Where can I find more information about it? Another question for Peru. In the Peruvian case of rural operators, the IMT spectrum, is it shared with the mobile operators? And how are frequencies assigned to rural operators? The next question is very long. And then there's information there. I'm sorry, his connect. So thank you for your questions then. Now, Doreen, it's your turn. Thank you, everyone. Good morning. It is a true pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you, CITEL, for inviting me to be a part of such an important and interesting seminar. The last 12 months have shown us that digital technologies are more vital than ever today. They have become our digital lifesavers during the COVID crisis. And even if that's the case, at this exact moment, there are still 3,700 people who are not connected. And unfortunately, can't part and segment of those people live in remote rural areas. And because of that, this panel is particularly significant in the region of the Americas, where over 120 million people are living in rural areas. And as you know, digital technologies are key in the transformation of the lives of people and communities, and to improve the economic and social conditions that will help us reach the 17 SDGs. Nevertheless, the last data from the ITU mark that the accessibility of connectivity between urban and rural areas remains persistent. While in our cities of the region, 74% of households have access to the internet, only half of households in rural areas have connectivity. And why is this digital divide so important? Well, precisely because the population that could benefit the most from the power of connectivity is that population that has the least access to digital services. And as we have all been able to see this year, this access is key if we want to build societies that are resilient, inclusive, and sustainable. In this context, has made the task of eliminating the digital divide a an urgent necessity. By increasing connectivity, we will ideally be expanding the access to basic services for the population of the Americas. The development office and agency of telecommunications of the ITU is committed to eliminating this divide. And because of that, we're working side by side with public and private partners to improve rural connectivity. Do allow me to highlight certain examples of what I believe are the best practices in this field. In the first place, I want to highlight that providing funding for network deployment is one of our biggest challenges. The high costs combined with the low income is a significant roadblock for which we have found some solutions. The ITU proposes what we have called the fifth generation regulation, which is a framework that promotes collaboration between regulators, the industry, as well as between other relevant stakeholders. This new type of regulation emphasizes principles such as the principle of sharing infrastructure and sharing resources. It also fosters the adoption of transparent operation agreements focused on promoting investment as well as setting up funding structures that share risk by having planning frameworks that focus on the long term. The work that governments do to produce public policies can also have a significant role in ensuring that services are affordable for all inhabitants of rural areas by having measures such as providing subsidies or lowering taxes to reduce costs. Another significant approach is what we know as a whole-up government that could be translated as a holistic government. This approach seeks to promote digital projects created with the object of benefiting multiple public services, which would allow then, in turn, to favor the development of e-government platforms and the reduction of expenses. Finally, we deem significant to adopt to have varied technologies that might help us bridge the digital gap. All of these are examples of how to promote a more significant deployment of the network. But this deployment of infrastructure is not about infrastructure, but it's also part of the puzzle in order to eliminate the digital divide. If we want to eliminate this divide, we also want to have affordable, stable, reliable economic technology sources, as well as increase the number of digital training activities, especially those that have content in local languages. These are all language areas in which the ITU is carrying out a significant number of activities, and I do want to very briefly mention some of them. We have a guide for connectivity solutions in the last mile. We know that there are many delegates here who are participating who have worked alongside us in order to develop our solutions guideline. We also have an initiative for the digital training centers that was developed along with the collaboration of Cisco. We have 2 centers in the region. We have 1 center in Dominican Republic. We have another in Brazil that was done with the Brazilian Federal Institute. We also have a guideline for the assessment of digital trainings as well that allows to provide support for the design of training programs. We have our own community connectivity program. We're working in Haiti along with other UN agencies. And we also have an initiative that is a collaboration between the ITU and UNICEF in order to provide connectivity for all schools across the world. GIGA is actually working in 19 countries right now, in 9 countries of the Caribbean, actually, and we are on the road to connecting over 86 million schools. And finally, as an example of our work to promote a whole-up government, the ITU is working on an initiative of smart villages or smart islands to facilitate access to health, education, and agriculture services. These are some examples of the work that we have been carrying out. But I also want to mention that we have an initiative as part of our regional initiatives of the ITU that focuses on deploying broadband in the region, precisely in rural areas. And I do want to welcome you and ask you to work together with us to move forward with this common challenge. Thank you for your attention. I now give the floor back to Oscar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doreen, for sharing your point of view on these practices. We told the panelists that we would have a second round with 4 minutes, but some of you talked a bit more, so we're going to reduce it to 3 minutes so that you can propose mechanisms that allow us to have that cooperation and synergy between countries. Thank you very much for your participation again. We will continue with the same order in which we started. So first we will have Julio Muñoz, the Vice Minister of Ecuador. Thank you very much, Oscar. Thank you very much also for what we heard from Mexico, Peru, Doreen. As Arturo said, these spaces allow us to nurture ourselves and see how to continue improving. In terms of international cooperation, it's good, and we have talked about it in the framework of the 7th LAC conference in that space. We talked about a fundamental strategy. This Latin American Fund of Connectivity and Digitalization, of rural digitalization, with which we want to generate the necessary funds to promote projects which are sustainable, social, and inclusive, so that in these areas that are more far away, they can be connected. And in that sense, the presidency of the ILAC and with the support of CITEL have generated a strategy in which we have worked together with the OAS for this regional agenda that was approved last year, this agenda of digital transformation, to be elevated to a presidential level, so that this is a priority of all the countries, that digital transformation and rural connectivity be part of the presidency and that declaration, so that they can work together. We have worked a lot with the OAS and the IDB for them to create a diagnosis of the funds that we already have in the sector. The sector creates a lot of money yearly, in which around $93,000 come back to the state due to different reasons, which are contributions, fees, rents, what the consumers pay. And the idea is from that income that we already have in the state, then how do we relocate that? How do we direct that correctly to rural connectivity? It's important because we already have funds. We need to have the correct priority. And that's why it's so important for this to be elevated to the presidential level, so that the regional agenda that all the countries approved can have the correct funding. Of course, we need to continue working with the international organizations in the constitution of this fund. There are many funds in Latin America, but we think in Ecuador that it's important to focus on one that's specific for this problem, which is to improve this digital divide in the rural sector specifically. So we are still working with the organizations. The IDB is really open to do this diagnosis and to see how we can implement this fund. And we think that this is a policy that goes beyond the government, that is a state policy, and that in that international cooperation, we can have the closure of that digital divide and to be able to connect all the Latin Americans who currently don't have internet connection. That is our priority as policymakers. And that's what the international cooperation needs to focus on, that we can generate among all of us. I don't want to continue talking too much about that, to give space to my other colleagues. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We'll now have Diego Carrillo speak. Thank you. I would like to answer some questions. Okay. So before I say what I was going to say, just to answer some of the questions that were asked by the participants of this forum regarding the use that is given nowadays to fiber optics and the projects of fiber optics in the country. Peru, what's been happening is a project that is the fiber optic network of the country, which is similar to the one of other countries. It's 1,350,000 kilometers of fiber optics in Peru. And this was done under a contract that nowadays is not working in the way that the state foresaw it in the beginning. It's a limited capability. We're talking about less than 10%. And we're already taking the necessary measures in order to take a decision in the following months in order to and work on this infrastructure. And as it was mentioned in one of the questions, to put this again for the benefit of the citizens. And along these lines are the regional projects and the district projects, which are being fostered by the Ministry of Transport and Communications. And as I explained in the beginning, this will have an important level of impact this year, and we will reach around 80% of the region with these projects, 80% of the country. There was an interesting comment about the digital community centers and how these would be handled with biosecurity measures, which nowadays all of our countries are living in a way or another, depending on the sanitary conditions that we currently have given the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is definitely something that is being considered. It shouldn't be a limitation. The spaces should still be implemented, and they can still include these biosecurity measures, but it's within the planning of the ministry for these first 500 centers of digital access that will be implemented during this year, during 2021. There was a comment about the OIMRs. I think that it's important to mention that the operator of rural infrastructure, this figure that was created in Peru a few years ago, according to our regulations, they are allowed to provide a service, but they don't have a spectrum. They don't provide services to final users. They just provide infrastructure in rural areas and ask mobile operators with a network directly to connect. So that touches different points of what was said. For example, what Doreen said a few minutes ago. We have to have clear something from the start. The problem of covering rural areas has three main axes: the conditions of the country, which is something that is regarding the landscape, but also